Hey, what is up, everybody? This is the Breach coming to you last night. Earlier this week, we took a look into the Rise of Fall of WCW. Last night, I woke up at like 2 in the morning for some unknown reason, and I couldn't fall back asleep. So I flipped on the WWE Network. I watched a few of the short shows, such as like Unfiltered with Renee Young. One thing led to another. I ended up checking out the Rise of Fall of WCW. I thought I would do a review of the documentary that came along with it. It was a really good documentary. Like I said, I've seen this before. It's the first time that I've seen it in a good little while. WCW is one of the the big companies. Of course, a lot of the guys, they like to take credit for almost putting the WWE out of business. I felt that was one of the sort of knocks I had on the table for 3 this week. When I was watching it with DDP, Vader, and with Sting, I basically thought that, all these years later, even though WWE clearly has won the war, DDP was still trying to put himself over as the guy that beat WWE for 2 years in the ratings and basically changed the face of professional wrestling. But all in all, I mean, like, WCW is something that is really thought after by wrestling fans. You can tell by all of the releases from WWE, DVDs, such as the Best of Starrcade, the Best of the Great American Bash, the Best of Clash of the Champions, Goldberg, the Rise and Fall of WCW, Best of Nitros 1 through 3, tons and tons of releases of WCW, people wanting to get their hands on this footage. I guess the WWE Network doesn't say that they get a lot of viewers viewing in on the old school Nitros, but it's one of the biggest things that I hear talked about as people going back and checking out the rise of the NWO in 1996 through 1997. Definitely a glory era of professional wrestling in my book. One of the hottest times as being a fan, when you're just sitting there flipping the channels back and forth. They tell an early story, Jim Crockett Promotions coming together. I still am a little bit mixed up. There was a lot of little territories being run back in the day. I've always heard about the Crockett's. I've always heard about Mid-Atlantic, the UWF, and somehow by the NWA, these groups all sort of came together. I'm not sure. The name that I hear about the most, more than anything else, is Jim Crockett, and I don't know if he bought them and merged them all together, but they all belonged to the NWA, which was basically all the territories had one leader, and they came together and they basically voted on who was going to be the champion. And this would sort of be the guy who would travel around to all the different territories. He would work television. He'd worked the shows in order to build up to a big show, and then once the champion was done in one promotion, he would move on to the next one, and he would sort of tour around the country like this. And the one guy that everyone remembers more than anybody else from this era would be Ric Flair. He was sort of like the wrestler of the 80s. He was the guy that just went everywhere and did everything with everybody. One of the greatest champions of all time, and he's one of the the cornerstones of WCW. It came to a time when Vince McMahon was trying to basically take over the whole United States with his worldwide expansion, and he went and basically went to the Superstation. The Superstation was in TBS. It was one of the major cable companies or cable networks, I guess you can say, that was all across the country. So basically, because of this, Jim Crockett Promotions with World Championship Wrestling, which before it was the name of the promotion, was actually the name of the show that was on Saturday nights at 6:05. Vince saw this as a great way to move in. He was having to buy up time slots all across the country by basically putting his show on all over, so that way WWF would be able to tour and people would know who they were. Vince looked at this, went to Turner, basically talked about buying the contract, which he ended up doing, where he would put WWF on in the time slot of World Championship Wrestling. This is known as Black Saturday. It's really weird. You see Vince McMahon standing in front of a World Championship Wrestling poster, and they sort of pass the torch to him. And what the agreement was supposed to be was that Vince would actually be filming his television in Atlanta and be sort of, using this to, push it out onto TBS. One thing leads to another. I don't think Vince had any plans of going down and filming his television in Atlanta. He just kept on using, older Madison Square Garden shows and, pushing guys such as Jimmy Superfly Snuka, the Iron Sheik, Big John Studd, were shown on this. And after about a month, basically, Crockett knew that he needed to get his television back or his company was going to go down. Ted Turner, he didn't feel that he was, Vince was living up to his agreement. So after about a month, the agreement was made for Vince to sell the time slot back to the Crockett's. And because of this, they paid $1 million to get the time slot back. That is what Vince would use to fund WrestleMania, which would put his company over even more. But without the $1 million and the time slot on TBS, the Crockett's wouldn't have been anything. Even with Dusty Rhodes, Ric Flair, they wouldn't have been able to get everything out there. But because of TBS was so widespread, the promotion started to grow, and that is sort of looked at as one of the reasons why the Crockett promotion failed. They just were spending too much money. They talk about running shows in Chicago, which worked. They were running shows all the way up and down the coast. They said they could get over as far as they went to about Philadelphia. Once they went into New York, that was basically Vince's territory, which didn't really work for them. But they started to go west, which would work. Because of the fact that TBS was spread all the way out there. They were doing shows in Los Angeles. They were doing shows in San Francisco. But the thing is that the Crockett's, they ended up buying 2 jets. They started running the shows on the West Coast, but they would be based out of Las Vegas. So these guys like Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes, all of these guys that were in the promotion, could feel like big shots, and they were just spending twice as much money as they were making. And at one day, basically, the money man walked into the room and just said, "Hey, we're $5 million in the hole. I mean, there's no way we can pull out of this." And the Crockett's, they had to go to Turner. Turner ended up buying it, and that way the wrestling would stay on TBS, which is one of the things that really built the Superstation. Was just that everybody was watching wrestling, everybody was watching that 605 thing, and they were able to sell ads to go on there, something that wrestling fans or wrestling companies can't do. Even Monday Night Raw can't demand high ad dollars for what goes on, on there. But from there, Turner would take it over, and basically Turner had to put people in charge of running the company. They went through a few. Of course, everybody knows about the headaches of Jim Herd. Jim Herd is a guy that is known as the Pizza Boy, who just basically didn't know anything about professional wrestling, tried to do everything in the world to basically kill wrestling, it seems like. From there, they went to Cowboy Bill Watts. Cowboy Bill Watts got WCW almost to the point where their debt was nothing. They weren't making a profit yet, but they were getting really, really close. But basically, Watts couldn't deal with having to deal with the suits inside of Turner. It was no secret that the people that were inside of Turner did not want anything to do with wrestling other than Ted Turner. And he just, he couldn't fight the cause anymore, which made them, bring in new people. Shoot, is it Bill Shaw? I think Bill Shaw is the guy who ends up getting put in charge. He's the president of WCW. He's not a wrestling guy, but he's a guy that can look over the numbers and make sure they're not doing too much. Bill Shaw is the guy who ends up bringing in Eric Bischoff. Eric Bischoff at that time was like a third-rate announcer. He had done announcing for the AWA. He tried out for WWE. He ended up finding himself in WCW. And he was enough of a guy that knew about wrestling but was not a wrestler that the Turner people could trust. So he ends up becoming the vice president of WCW. From there, he is the guy that starts making all of the big deals to make WCW start to grow. The first thing that they're able to do, they hire Hulk Hogan, who is basically, I don't want to say he was shunned away from WWE, but, Vince got to the point where he didn't think Hogan was going to work for them anymore, and they were going in a new direction with Yokozuna, with Shawn Michaels, with Bret Hart. He just basically thought the guys like him, the Macho Man, they'd been used up enough, and there was nothing really left to try and get out of them. The fans were changing. They weren't, all babyface, goody two-shoes. Hogan came in to WCW with a whole lot of fanfare. People knew who Hulk Hogan was. People still wanted to believe in Hulkamania. But honestly, in my mind, WCW was still looked at as the second-rate Bush League promotion. Even with Hogan on top, it just didn't seem like it was going to matter that much. I'm not saying that I didn't watch or I didn't check it out. It just didn't really seem like, the big leagues, even though, they build up Bash at the Beach. The first meeting of Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair, they had Mr. T there, who was already, past his prime as being a guy, but they had Shaquille O'Neal there, something that they don't talk about all that much. When, they talk about all the celebrities that made appearances. This is at the height of Shaq Fu, Shaquille O'Neal being a huge star. And, he's there. He raises Hogan's hand. I think he was like the outside enforcer, I think is what his job was at this match, to try and keep the Horsemen out or something like that. But it just, Hogan got the belt, and it just was business as normal. You had him, you had the Horsemen, Macho Man came, but it wasn't until Monday Nitro debuted when Turner gave WCW, he says 2 hours, but I always thought that Nitro always started out as 1 hour, and then when there were ratings behind it, then it got moved to 2 hours. But because of this, we see a change in the game where basically they figure out that a lot of their baby faces need to be, re-upped. They need to be sort of repackaged and re-put back out there, because there's times when it just doesn't work anymore. From there, we see Hulk Hogan turn heel with the birth of the NWO, bringing in Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. Eric Bischoff realized that, WWF was running with these cartoonish gimmicks on the other side, with, everybody having to have a day job. And he just wanted the guys to be real. He started giving them their own real names and their real personas so they can act like themselves. And people connected with that more. The NWO would go on to do huge money for them. Maybe it went a little bit too long. But they were able to reestablish themselves, with bringing in new things to wrestling, such as the cruiserweights. They found a bright new star in Goldberg, who I didn't really talk about, was like the new Magnum TA for them. Magnum TA was a wrestler in the 80s who basically had everything that it took to be a big star in the world of professional wrestling. People were in love with this guy. He could work, he could talk, and he got in an accident, and basically it made it where he wasn't going to be able to wrestle anymore. But Goldberg came on, and it was almost like Goldberg was a big push for WCW, but they still had all of the trash and all of the politics that went around that just got it to the point where people wanted to watch Goldberg, where people didn't want to watch everything else that went along with it. Nitro was a big time success. They beat Raw in the ratings for 2 years, but once they probably did Goldberg versus Hogan for the title in the Atlanta Georgia Dome, I think from there it was all downhill from WCW. I think that was probably the last time that they won a night in the ratings war between WWE and WCW. But just because they start highlighting all of the mistakes. Honestly, I know you have to tell the story of WCW dying if you have a DVD called The Rise and Fall of WCW, but just... man, those dying days at WCW were bad. They start talking about all of the celebrities that came into play. Karl Malone, Dennis Rodman, which was big. But then you followed it up with Jay Leno and whatever Jay Leno's bandmate was, and David Arquette and this, that, and the other. They just kept on trying to just do things over and over again that just were not working, and they weren't working. They bring in Vince Russo, who seemed like they thought was going to be the guy to save it, because he was the guy that came up with The Rock and came up with Stone Cold Steve Austin. Vince Russo is the guy that had a whole lot of good ideas, but the one thing that was working for him is that he filters his ideas through Vince McMahon, who I think is one of the biggest wrestling geniuses in the world. And for every 10 ideas that Vince Russo came up with, maybe Vince gave the green light and okayed 2 of them. The day comes when basically WCW says that, or I guess TBS and TNT says that WCW isn't going to be on television anymore. They're not going to have it on either one of their networks. They're pulling the plug. Vince ends up buying WCW. The legacy of WCW lives on today through all of the DVDs and the WWE network and everything like that. It's something that people just don't want to let go of. It's crazy. I mean, what Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair built, what Hulk Hogan, Goldberg, and the NWO, are still able to live on today. It's some of the great times. If you go and you pick up the DVD and you look at disc 2, it's got like 10 of the greatest matches of the NWA and the WCW on there. It's a must-have for any WWE DVD collector. A great time in professional wrestling, and it's probably going to live on forever in people's minds.